May the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart reflect your glory, Jesus, and be enlightening for us all. Let me start by thanking Hildegard for changing the altar cloths, also called paraments, I discovered. Vestments for the people's body and paraments for the table, for changing the paraments to white today. You may not know it, but this is the last Sunday in the church year. And in many churches, it is celebrated as a very special day called the Reign of Christ Sunday or Christ the King Sunday. With the start of Advent next Sunday, a new church year begins. So almost Happy New Year. Every religion seems to have its own way to measure the passage of time and different celebrations. We let these differences separate us. We celebrate the differences because we feel as if they define us, our individuality, our uniquenesses, our specialness, our tradition, our history. Think about the special ways your family celebrates different holidays. We like to preserve traditions, or sometimes even to resurrect them, as I am doing with this sermon. I find it very interesting that our denomination, Christian Church Disciples of Christ, has let go a lot of these differences, like not celebrating the last Sunday of the church year, even though our book of prayers for the elders makes it quite clear that it's the last Sunday of the year. Hence, Hildegard, quite correctly, told me that the altar cloth would not change to white until next week for Advent. By keeping the green altar cloth, this Sunday is marked in our church as ordinary time. But the idea of a new year lingers in that this is the Sunday when, as a congregation, we vote on our governing board for next year and approve our budget for next year and share a feast together, giving thanks for all our blessings over the past year. So while we no longer acknowledge this special Sunday, that is Christ the King Sunday, we keep the traditions of the church year ending. So I asked her to do white altar cloths, and she did. What do churches celebrate on Christ the King Sunday, the last Sunday before Advent, besides the passing of the old year? Literally, that Christ is King. Not in the paternal, patronizing, often morally corrupt way in which human kings rule their earthly kingdoms, but in a different way. This sermon looks both backwards and looks forward, just the way we usually do at New Year's, remembering the past years, and making resolutions for the future. We evaluate where we've been to clarify where we want to go. Traditionally, Christ the King Sunday is when Christians declare Christ as King, the one who reigns over our lives and in our hearts. The language is quite undemocratic and feels out of date, but the sovereignty of Christ is exactly the issue Pontius Pilate was forced to rule upon before the crucifixion. And it is a question each of us must resolve in our own hearts. And it's nice to do it before Advent. Let's look at the conversation on the question of kingship between Pilate and Jesus in the Gospel of John. Before we do so, I just want to acknowledge that I grew up in my creed saying, crucified under Pontius Pilate. It was an idiom in our house that Pontius Pilate washed his hands of the affair. Pontius Pilate was undoubtedly the baddie in my growing up. So in this reading today, I re-examined that. I asked what Pontius Pilate was really doing and what Jesus was really doing, and by extension, what we're to do. So the gospel today is from the Gospel of John, chapter 18, verses 33 to 38a, the first half of verse 38, just to complete the story. Then Pilate entered the headquarters again, summoned Jesus, and asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus answered, "Do you ask this on your own, or did others tell you about me?" Pilate replied, "I'm not a Jew, am I? Your own nation and the chief priests have handed you over to me. What have you done?" Jesus answered, "My kingdom does not belong to this world. If my kingdom belonged to this world, my followers would be fighting to keep me from being handed over to the Jews. But as it is, my kingdom is not from here." Pilate asked him, "So you are a king?" Jesus answered, "You say that I am a king. For this I was born. For this I came into the world, to testify to the truth. Everyone who belongs to the truth listens to my voice." Pilate asked him, "What is truth?" This is a text usually read on or around Good Friday as part of the Passion story, as it describes his trial before the crucifixion. But there is a sense in which this narrative, this dialogue, is a most important episode, one of the most important, in defining the whole story of Jesus. These 5 verses encapsulate the whole meaning and purpose of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, made manifest in flesh here in the world. There's also a response to that human form that may be our unfortunate response to God in our midst today. We have 2 issues: whether we acknowledge Christ as sovereign, and where or how Christ reigns. Let's look more closely at the text. Pilate returns to his palatial offices only to find that the Jewish leaders have brought this man, this rabble-rouser, Jesus, bound and beaten, before him for condemnation. We know from history that only the Roman authorities had the power to condemn someone to death. Pilate is reluctant, partly because he doesn't really want to get involved in internal squabbles here in Judea. After all, he is here to represent Rome and keep the peace. Law and order, that's what Pilate stands for. Temple politics and mystical religions don't interest him in the least, as long as people keep quiet and pay their taxes. Pilate couldn't have cared less what kind of God they worshipped. He was also reluctant because he could see no harm in this man. Perhaps Jesus was a bit deluded, a bit excited about the God he spoke of, but he was really just a country kid with a Messiah complex. To condemn such a one to death by crucifixion did not sit well with Pilate's ulcers. Yet, Pilate was there to keep the peace. The leaders of the people complained that Jesus was stirring up the populace, and they didn't take the hint that Pilate gave the first time around and take this poor, bruised, wounded man away. So he was obligated to at least make some kind of interrogation to at least ask some questions. With a sigh, he sat down behind his big oaken desk with the picture of his wife and the paperweight bust of Caesar himself, and said to the man they held, bowed and bloody and bound before him, "So, you are the king of the Jews?" The man, with his hands tied behind his back and his bruised lips beginning to swell, answered that question with his own question. "Do you ask this on your own, or did others tell you about me?" Think about that for a minute. Do you ask questions on your own because you thought of it or because you felt it? Or is it that other people told you things and that's what you think or believe? Audacious approach to interrogation, to answer a question with a question. I wouldn't try it on a police detective interrogating you. This turns the tables on Pilate and immediately puts Pilate, the person in charge, on the defensive. This conversation is transactional, so we're examining the transaction between the two men. Pilate replies, "I'm not a Jew, am I?" In other words, how do I know what the Jews say and who the Jews say is king? Your own nation and the chief priests have handed you over to me. They don't say you're king. What have you done? Jesus said, "My kingdom is not of this world. If it were, I would have subjects who would rise up to fight for me, to keep me from being captured and beaten and bound. If I were, I would rule and lead and act like a king. But my kingship, my reign, comes not from this world." That quiet reply takes the steam out of Pilate's outrage and deflates his argument. You say that I am king. You say, they say, everyone says that I am king. But I was born. I came into this world to bear witness to the truth. Note the emphasis on you say. Is there an implicit question here for us? Do we say that Jesus is king? There is a brief pause. Pilate leans back in his chair and addresses the ceiling as much as the man before him and asks, hoping and not hoping? We don't know. Pilate asks, what is truth? The question is asked. How do you hear this question? Behind this question, do you hear the bored complacency of a bureaucratic ruler stuck 1,000 miles from home in a backward little country, sitting as judge over backward little squabbles between backward little peoples? What could one of these possibly know about truth? As a politician, Pilate knew that truth was malleable, hammered into specific situations to bring about specific outcomes. He knew that truth was a commodity, like patriotism and power, to be bought and sold for the benefit of the ruling class. Can you hear the sneer at the very idea of kingship, of truth, even as he asks this 3-word question, what is truth? Okay, if you heard the sneer, because that's what I grew up with, listen to the next paragraph. Or, behind that question, do you hear, perhaps, a spark of hope that maybe this man, Jesus, broken and bruised as he is, bound and tied as he is, can give some kind of response and tell, finally, what truth is? The response to this offhand question, the response to this, what might be a plea for light in a world of darkness, the response in the Gospel of John is silence. This silence cuts through assumptions and easy confidence and forces Pilate and perhaps us to struggle, however ineptly, to face ourselves and to answer the question ourselves. Pilate's question still sounds in the 21st century. What is truth? What is truth? How many times and in how many ways do we ask that question? Nowadays, we have fact checkers. I love fact checkers. But we still do not have truth checkers. Even a lie detection thing is only measuring your body responses. It doesn't measure truth. We don't have truth checkers other than what we find in ourselves. What's it all about? Why am I here? Why do I have to keep going? Why can't I ever get ahead? Who or what is God, and why is God so far away when I hurt the most, if he even exists? What must I do to be a follower of Christ in a world that tries so hard to go another way, its own way? This wonderful, almost magical, somehow mystical story of Jesus, who is the King, but not of this world? Tell me, is it true? Those are the questions, those and many more that we bring to church, that we carry with us at work, that sit in the back of our throats as we wait for a place to ask and for someone to answer. And no one gives us an answer. Jesus does not reply to Pilate's question, what is truth? At the same time, the silence in response to Pilate's question shows somehow that even to ask in the first place is to misunderstand truth. The irony of this scene in Pilate's office is that the truth was staring him in the face, and he completely missed it and still asked, what is truth? By asking the question, he was turning away from the only truth that can mean anything in a world such as ours. The truth is embodied in one who lived and loved and gave of himself to create a sense of connection and belonging, restoration and transformation. The truth that is discovered in relationship, especially in relationship with Christ the King, in obedience, and freedom because we choose Him in bowing down and rising up in heart and in soul. Jesus tells Pilate, "My kingdom is not of this world." Many have interpreted this to mean that Jesus' kingdom is somewhere in heaven and not relevant to this world. There are people who survive this world by saying they're working to go to heaven. Heaven is where they'll really live. To me, Jesus is saying that the values of his kingdom are different from those of the current system. In other words, Jesus does not have to exercise the type of authority that seeks to be on top, which results in oppression, corruption of the judicial system, and precisely the kind of hypocrisy that Pilate exhibited in the interaction between him and Jesus. Jesus tells him, if my kingdom were from this world, were based on what you're talking about, my followers would be fighting to keep me from being handed over. But as it is, my kingdom is not from here. It's not based on those values. The values of Jesus' kingdom are so vastly different from those of this world that often we Christians fail to understand them. The church, which purports to be and should represent Jesus' kingdom, is here to serve in humility rather than to seek earthly power. He said it clearly in the Beatitudes, "Blessed be the poor, the meek," etc. Jesus is the King, yet he does not arrive in a chariot but on a donkey. Jesus is a king who is killed by those with power, not a king who is victorious over his enemies by defeating them in war. Where is the kingdom of Jesus? On this earth, it can only be in our hearts and minds. When we acknowledge him as King and try to live as he taught us by his word and his example. That's what Christ the King Sunday is all about. Sort of a culmination of the whole year of the church, if you want. To remind each of us that we serve a king like no other, a king who is not seeking power and glory, but humble service to others. Consequently, we who identify as the church should seek to engage in humble service to others. Everyone interested in seeking truth will embrace the values of this other kingdom, which contrasts sharply with the society that seeks to win at all costs. Those who seek power and prestige at the expense of others are rejecting the true kingdom represented by Jesus. Christ the King Sunday, the formal name for today, the year end of the church year, offers us an opportunity for the church and for each of us to assess our values and evaluate how we operate in our society. This can lead to a clarification of mission and point us in the direction Jesus intends for us, so that we may truly be the real church that our world so desperately needs. What is truth? Pilate asks. I'm not sure Pilate is the baddie. The new year approaches. Next Sunday starts Advent. I pray that it will bring each of us and this church, this congregation, this blessed body of people, compassion and peace. In the name of Christ the King, amen.